those of you who are joining us online via our live stream. This will be, I think, a really important conversation in light of our upcoming election next week. And so to get us started, it is my honor to introduce the president of Brooklyn College, Michelle J. Anderson.
Thank you, Professor Gaston Alonso. He is the wonderful director of the Ethel Wolf Institute for the Humanities. Let's give a round of applause for Gaston. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you here to this important and timely lecture to our beautiful campus on a beautiful day during a beautiful time of the year. This is an incredibly timely and important event, as Gaston pointed out. This lecture couldn't be more important. What Latino history teaches us about our politics exactly 1 week before the national presidential election. Professor Geraldo Cadava of Northwestern University joins us today as the Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar to deliver this lecture. And the visiting scholar program brings outstanding researchers to colleges across the country for 2-day residencies where they meet with students and faculty, and then they deliver an important public lecture. And this is your lecture. I'm very excited to hear it. I want to thank the Brooklyn College chapter of Phi Beta Kappa and everyone at the Wolf Institute, everyone, the staff at the Wolf Institute, as well as Gaston, for organizing this event, and as well as the co-sponsors who are listed in the program. I also want to thank the National Phi Beta Kappa Society, whose generous support made this visit possible and whose secretary and CEO is with us here today, Frederick M. Lawrence, as a special guest. Mr. Lawrence. Frederick Lawrence is the 10th Secretary and CEO of the National Phi Beta Kappa Society. It is the oldest and most prestigious honor society in the country. Founded in 1776, he himself is a distinguished lecturer at Georgetown University Law Center, was previously the president of Brandeis University and the dean at George Washington University School of Law. He has also been a visiting professor at Yale Law School. He's a member of both the American Philosophical Society and the American Law Association. He's an expert on civil rights, free expression, and bias crimes. He's published widely and lectured internationally on these important topics. So what a treat it is to have Frederick Lawrence with us here today. And I'm pleased to be able to turn the mic over to you, Fred, for your remarks.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, all of you at Brooklyn College, for making this event possible for us. We at Phi Beta Kappa have had a visiting scholar program for almost 70 years, and that's almost as long as Brooklyn College has had a chapter of Phi Beta Kappa. We keep track of a lot of this history stuff, being 250 years old almost, which is actually relevant to our proceeding today. We were founded on the cold winter night of December 5th, 1776, 6 months after the founding of the country. This is not a coincidence. What the founders of Phi Beta Kappa understood with a vision that animates us still is the inextricable link between the liberal arts and sciences and a functioning democracy. I like to think of it as the values of July 4th, 1776, and the values of December 5th, 1776, our founding date. The values of July 4th still not yet realized, a work in progress to say the very least, but a aspiration that is still the right aspiration. Some of them are words we know too well, so they sort of go down too easily and we forget what they mean. It's helpful to pick up documents like the Declaration of Independence and read it as if you were reading it for the first time. You know, what do those words actually mean if you didn't know what was coming next? That the governments derive their just authority, by the way, you can derive authority lots of ways. Their just authority from the consent of the governed. Well, that's sort of obvious to us now, or is it? What does consent mean? Consent's got to be an informed consent, or it's no consent at all, is it? So, baked into the mission of July 4th, 1776, is we have to find a way of educating a population so that people can ask questions, can pull apart arguments, can be skeptical in all the best ways, in all the right ways. And that's why 6 months later, a group of undergraduates on the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, got together and they founded a society that they called not Phi Beta Kappa, that they called Societas Philosophia, which is why if you get one of these, a member of Phi Beta Kappa, and you flip it around, you'll see it says SP on the back. That's why. Latin meaning Philosophic Society. Phi Beta Kappa stands for the Greek motto they adopted that night, December 5th, 1776, a motto we usually translate as love of learning is the guide of life. Are there any classicists in the hall? Oh, good, then I can make it up. Oh, there's one. Okay, I got to be careful then. You'll tell me if I get this right. Philosophia via Kubernetes, we usually translate as love of learning is the guide of life, but Kubernetes, from which we actually get the English word governor, in classical Greek has got a marine connotation, right? And so a slightly better translation, subtly different, but significantly different, is that the love of learning is the pilot of life, or the helm of life. You see, the guide takes you on a path that already exists, but the helm, the pilot, steers you out into the water, where there is no path. And sometimes the waters are choppy, as they were in 1776, and as they most decidedly are in our time. One of the reasons that our topic today is as relevant as it is that we are living in challenging times. We are living in choppy waters. What our founders committed themselves to with that motto that animates us still is that in those choppy times, the pilot will not be some dogma. The pilot will not be something that is said by one person that we're all supposed to follow. The pilot will be the love of learning, not even learning, but the love of learning, the process of learning. That's what we committed ourselves to. That is the essential value that Phi Beta Kappa built in from its founding. And then, almost 70 years ago, on this campus, founded a chapter of which we are enormously proud. About 1/3 of our chapters are at public institutions, but it is fair to say, I'm going to give Matthew a little shout out, it is fair to say that the highest yield rate, that is to say, people made offers of Phi Beta Kappa who understand the values of it, who understand what free expression means, what academic freedom means, what liberal arts and sciences education means, and accept the honor, but also the duty, obligations that come with being a member of Phi Beta Kappa. The highest yield rate of any public school is right here at Brooklyn College. So I could be saying that just to blow smoke at you because that's what a nice guest does to his hosts, but I'll conclude with this. This one's personal. I'm probably going to get emotional with this, so I'm going to disclose it right up front. My late mother was Brooklyn College class of 1937. This place changed her life, and therefore it changed mine. And I'm sure it's changing yours. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for what you do for Phi Beta.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, President Anderson. Before introducing Professor Cadava, I would like to add to and amplify President Anderson's thanks to the Wolf Institute, and especially to its director, Professor Gaston Alonso. Professor Alonso has worked tirelessly and with awe-inspiring efficiency to make Professor Cadava's residency a success. He did the vast majority of the heavy lifting, and so on behalf of our chapter and of everyone here today, a very heartfelt thank you. Please join me in giving Professor Alonso a round of enthusiastic applause. I also want to thank my colleague on the executive committee of the chapter, Sharona Levy, who has worked very hard as well to make these events a reality. And I want to welcome Andrew Rainiak from the New York Association of Phi Beta Kappa. Andrew, it's wonderful to have you with us today. And now to our main event. Geraldo Cadava is Professor of History and Latino Studies and Director of American Studies at Northwestern University. He is the author of 2 books on the borderlands and Latino history, Standing on Common Ground, The Making of a Sunbelt Borderland, and The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of a Political Identity from Nixon to Trump. He is a regular contributor to The New Yorker, and as you are about to see, a highly insightful and well-informed commentator on the American political scene, past and present. With an epoch-making presidential election just a few days off, we would be hard-pressed to find a more appropriate or engaging speaker. Please join me in extending a warm Brooklyn College welcome to Professor Geraldo Cadava.
With these introductions, I can only fail now. And now seeing you, Mr. Lawrence, get emotional, I was getting emotional watching you get emotional to hear such a conviction about the mission of a place and the impact that it had on your family's life, and I assume everyone else's life here. And indeed, I will say that, like, having participated in these Phi Beta Kappa scholar visits, I know that my time on this campus has also shaped my life. And I will say that also about the University of South Carolina and Muhlenberg College, where I've visited before coming here. And then I assume the same will be true of the next 5 places that I go to over the course of the year, because the conversations, again, I don't mean to like dismiss the conversations I've had with professors, but the conversations I've had with the students are truly enlightening and are in a window into the world from a perspective that I don't always see. My son's 11. He will be your age at some point, and then I'll have the chance to see the world through his eyes again. But for now, I'm understanding how college kids see the world from you all, and I thank you for giving me that. What I'm going to talk about is what Latino history teaches us about Latino politics. I had planned on giving a lecture that really kind of leaned into the history part of this and telling you a little bit about, this goes back to when Matthew and Gaston and I were planning this visit back in the summer, where we were talking about what I was going to do. But I think, the closer we've gotten to the election, me having attended the Trump rally at MSG, being 5 days away from the election and going to cover the election in Allentown, Pennsylvania on Election Day has changed what I want to say to you a little bit, I think, because I think I hope to have, maybe not necessarily in time-wise, but in kind of the present-day framing, I hope to talk more about politics. I'm just shifting the balance a little bit. Like, I thought I was going to really lean into the history part of it and gesture towards some things about politics, but I might equally talk about politics today. Before I do that, I realized I didn't offer some thanks that I should have offered. Just kind of launched right in. But I really want to thank Matthew and Gaston for inviting me to campus. I guess, like, learning who the Phi Beta Kappa scholars are, you still have to pick a name, not necessarily out of a hat, but you have to choose scholars who you think will talk about something that will be of some sort of meaning to your community. And I'm really grateful that you chose me, and I thank you for hosting me. I also want to thank President Anderson. You're the first president who's come to any of my Phi Beta Kappa lectures, and also, likewise, I've never had representatives from the Phi Beta Kappa organization come to my Phi Beta Kappa lectures. So
the expectations
are high. They're high. They're very high. And look, I mean, it's easy to get people to come to New York City. I get it, and but yeah, and it's an honor. I mean, I hope from your perspectives, it's an opportunity to see how this program is actually going, and I've truly loved it. I've truly loved it. So, and thank you all students for coming and for kind of interacting with me over the past couple of days, and when I've asked you to share some of your stories with me, being open about things and kind of sharing where you come from and what kind of things are on your mind, what kinds of things you're excited about and concerned about as well. Okay, so now I think I can return to Latino history and Latino politics. And even in the title of that, you might sense some of my orientation toward these subjects, because I am a historian. I am trained as a historian. I have only written books of history, but increasingly I've also been involved in kind of more public-facing commentary about politics today. And I can tell you a little bit about, and again, I'm working on a book of history now, and the book I'm writing is a kind of 500-year of history of Latinos, from the Spanish colonial times to the present. But even the way that I came to conceive of that project came from my thinking about politics and political discourse right now about Latinos. So I wrote my first book about the Arizona-Sonora border. I'm from Tucson, Arizona, so it made sense for me to write a project on a place that I was from and wanting to understand from a kind of scholar's vantage point something about the place that I was born. And then there was a particular connection between that book and my second book. I published my first book in 2013, and then I started my second book 2014, 2015. So I've been thinking about Latino conservatism probably my whole life, because my grandfather he died a couple of years ago, but was a deeply conservative Latino. He was Colombian, Panamanian, served in the military. He was born in Panama, but served in the military for most of his career, retired after 20 years, and then worked in copper mines in Arizona, and then for the first time voted for Ronald Reagan. He had voted for Democrats before, but voted for Ronald Reagan in 1980 because Reagan was promising to put more money into his biweekly paychecks in the form of tax cuts. So he became a Republican for that very particular issue, for that very particular reason, but then over the next 36 years, the last election he voted in was 2016, he just came to embrace every position of the Republican Party. In fact, it didn't even matter what the positions of the Republican Party were. It just mattered that they were Republican. In 2016, when I was talking to him about Donald Trump, he just assured me that Donald Trump is a good guy because he's a Republican. It had nothing to do with anything else. It was just that he was this has a lot to say, I think, about just the evolution of partisan identities. And I became curious about how my grandfather, who became involved in Republican Party politics, actually, I shouldn't even put it that formally. He was not involved in Republican Party politics. He was a Republican who voted for Republicans, but he never involved himself in the party in any way. He was, I guess you would say, not a low propensity voter that you hear about today, because he voted in every election, but he wasn't the kind of voter that necessarily like polling firms would call and would get so much campaign literature because he was like out there in his involvement with the Republican Party. He was just a kind of regular voter. And his kind of evolution as a Republican taught me some things, I think, about partisan loyalty and how difficult partisan loyalty can be to shake after identifying in one way after 36 years or 40 years. That's some of my personal background that lead me to study some of the things that I do. And the reason I brought up the fact that I started research on the project about Hispanic Republicans in about 2014 is just to suggest that I had been thinking about Latino conservatism well before the 2020 election, when the phenomenon of Latino Republican identity kind of broke into national conversation because Donald Trump expanded his share of the Latino vote between 2016 and 2020, and that was surprising to so many because of the kind of Republican that Donald Trump is. And how could Latinos support this man who had based so much of his I don't know what's in the man's heart, but he based so much of his campaign persona around the politics of anti-immigration and statements that many Latinos consider to be anti-Latino. And I say many because I don't think his Latino followers believe that we can talk about this, but they don't believe that he is fundamentally anti-Latino. So that has been the conversation over the past 4 years. Ever since 2020 offered us one data point, we've been wondering for the past 4 years, like, what's going to happen in 2024? Is 2020 just going to kind of be a blip on the radar screen, or is it a sign of a longer lasting evolution of the Latino community away from the Democratic Party toward the Republican Party? I don't think we're going to answer that question even in a week from now. I do think that one advantage that a historical perspective gives me is that I can kind of see this phenomenon over a much longer period of time. And indeed, the book that I wrote was about Latino conservatism since the 1970s to the present, really. I mean, I go back a little further, but really from the 70s to the present, during which period approximately 25 to 35% of Latinos have supported Republican candidates. There are some exceptions to that. Gerald Ford, Bob Dole received less than that 25% baseline. George W. Bush received more in 2000, 2004. And in that sense, you know, Trump's performance, according to exit polls, in both 2016 and 2020, fell within a historical norm. It wasn't so aberrant. But again, I think the shock came from seeing that this particular kind of Republican could increase his support among Latinos. And he was such a contrast to George W. Bush, who was the last Republican who earned 40 or so % of the Latino vote. So I don't think anyone expected that Donald Trump would kind of be the second coming of George W. Bush when it came to recruiting Latino voters. All of these things are things that we can talk more about, but I want to just help you understand a little bit about my evolution as a scholar and how I arrived at the kind of thinking I do today about both Latino history and Latino politics. One of the things, so basically, my book came out in May of 2020. The election came out in November 2020. Again, because of the evolution of this project for me, I was more interested in explaining this broader world of Latino conservatism that my grandfather had been a part of for so long. I wasn't writing about Latino Republican identity in order to like weigh in on some political conversation. But after the 2020 election, you know, that is kind of what media called on me to do because I had expertise in something. I had done research for a long time on a topic that many people wanted to understand. That wasn't the beginning of my more public-facing work, but it's certainly when it took off. I wouldn't be a writer for the New Yorker today if it hadn't been for the 2020 election. I'm positive of that. So I was thinking more about the intensity of interest in the Latino conservative phenomenon and going back, you know, to thinking about what we all needed to understand about Latino history in order to understand about Latino politics, because I think Latinos have long been frustrated that we're primarily seen as either Republicans or Democrats, or citizens or foreigners. You know, the two main times when we enter kind of national public consciousness is during election season, or when there's some sort of crisis, real or manufactured, at the border. And I presume, I don't think any Latino could speak for all Latinos. It's impossible just on the face of it, but I think that all of us believe that we are more than just voters or immigrants. So I wanted to go back and try to understand what about our history led to different viewpoints on a range of subjects. So I was turning to history to understand politics because I'm a historian, but also because I believe that the more we understand about the evolution of Latinos as over a long period of time, the more understandable our political divisions today seem. And not necessarily as Republicans or Democrats. I want to be very clear that like liberalism and conservatism is not the same thing as Democrat and Republican. And to me, it's more important to understand history and broader concepts like liberalism and conservatism to understand who Latinos are than to understand whether we're going to vote for a Democrat or a Republican. I will say it was easier for me to write about Republicans because we can talk more about this too, but as a matter of finding an archive, it's easier to find in archives like Republican partisan identity because there are elections, there are pollsters tracking change over time. Conservatism is kind of a more nebulous concept, and it also, what conservative and liberal are, change a lot over time from the 19th century to the 20th century, and what seems conservative today was actually quite liberal in the late 19th century. I can talk about that a little bit when we get to the Spanish-American War part of the lecture. So I wanted to go back to history to understand things. I also have been thinking about Joaquin Castro. He's been on this kind of mission for the past couple of years, trying to increase or at least note out, or to call out or to note the underrepresentation of Latinos in all sorts of media industries, in Hollywood, in magazines, in newspapers. And he said something pretty powerful, that like Americans don't know who Latinos are. And I think that the idea that we're either only Democrats or Republicans, or that we're immigrants or citizens, is related to this idea of Americans don't really know who Latinos are. So that's why I went back to history and thought of writing a project that goes back to the beginning of Latino history, recognizing that what is the beginning of Latino history is itself a kind of contested, it's a matter of debate. In fact, in my lecture classes at Northwestern on Latino history, the first essay that my students write about is, should we consider the Spanish colonial period to be the beginning of Latino history? Of course, people in the 16th century did not consider themselves Latino. They did not have that language. I mean, it turns out, going back to early modern Spain, there were concepts of like Latino, which was a kind of actually Christianized Spaniards. So it could include Moors or Jewish people who had converted to Christianity. So to me, that's really interesting, because even the term Latino then implies, from the very beginning, even in Spain, before anyone even comes to the Americas, it implies, mixture and conversion and syncretism and things like that. Nevertheless, the term Latino as we use it today, like, it didn't exist in the 16th century. So Nevertheless, many of my students still say, I would say the majority of my students still say that yes, the Spanish colonial period is the period where we should go looking for the beginnings of Latino history, because where did we get this idea that Latinos are Catholics? Where did we get the idea that one of the fundamental characteristics of a Latino is that we speak Spanish? Gosh, I'm trying to think of other things, but there's no doubt, to my mind, that I think this is the correct answer, for what it's worth, that you do have to go back to the Spanish colonial period to understand the roots of Latino history. Some of my students actually tried to push it back further and say, like, to focus on the Spanish colonial period prioritizes the European side of our identity and contributes to the erasure, or at least the diminution of our indigenous identity. So actually, we need to understand, like, pre-contact history in order to understand Latino history. I understand that. I don't quite agree, because I do think that whatever we take Latino history to mean, it means by definition encounter and contact and mixing. And so I understand the idea of that they're trying to convey, but I also think that Latino by definition means mixture and contact and encounter. On the other side, some students, a smaller number, argue that no, to understand Latino history, you really can only begin talking about that maybe in the late 19th century, when you had intellectuals like Jose Marti conceiving of pan-Latin American identity, like a group identity. What was Latin America? And what was its relationship to the United States? That's the beginning of Latino history. And then I had other students say that no, you can't really talk about Latino history until you get to the 1960s or 1970s, because that was the period when Latino groups themselves in the United States were thinking about their relationship to one another in order to have the most political power in US politics. And that was also about the government. I mean, when people talk about the term Hispanic, one of the objections to it is that it's a term created by the Nixon administration in 1970, when it was a category on the US Census for the first time, as a way of counting who the Latino population was at the time. Before 1970, the way that people who thought of themselves as Latino were counted was as people of Spanish-speaking origin. Or there was one census in 1930 where Mexican was listed as a separate racial category, but because of like the activism of groups like the League of United Latin American Citizens, who felt kind of almost singled out by the term Mexican, then had it erased from the census in 1940, and once again, Latinos were just categorized as white. We can talk about the history of that as well. So these are some possible answers to the question of when Latino history began. And so when I say I'm going back to the Spanish colonial period, I don't, to talk about the origins of Latino history, I don't want you to think that I am not aware that Latino itself is a kind of contested category, and its history didn't necessarily emerge. It didn't emerge in the 16th century. I'm still going back to that period, though, as the beginning of Latino history. And so I'll say that the final reason I wanted to tell a long story of Latinos is that I think the few sweeping histories of Latinos that are out there don't tell the full story. They don't present the full picture. And I'll tell you what I mean. I'm thinking in particular of books by people like Juan Gonzalez called Harvest of Empire. Has anyone read that? Heard of it? Couple? I'm thinking of a more recent book by Laura Gomez called Inventing Latinos. I'm thinking of a book by the journalist Paula Ramos called Finding Latinx. And I'm thinking of a book by a historian at Notre Dame named Felipe Fernandez Armesto, who is a historian. He's the only historian, interestingly. I mean, those other three I mentioned, they're non-historians who've written the big histories of Latino history, big histories of Latinos in the United States. So Juan Gonzalez is a journalist, Paula Ramos is a journalist, Laura Gomez is a sociologist and law professor. So it was also interesting to me that like the big histories of Latinos were written by non-historians. Felipe Fernandez Armesto is a historian, but he's a historian of early modern Europe, and he's like a British Don, actually. He's a Spaniard who went to Oxford and wrote a book called Nuestra America, Hispanics in the United States. And the prologue to that book is actually written by the Spanish Minister of Culture, and it's part of a kind of recovery project of Spain's legacy in the Americas. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but like, obviously, I mean, there are lots of flashpoints when anti-Spanish views have emerged in the United States. One of them was around the quincentenary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas in 1992. And since then, but even, I would say like for hundreds of years before then, there was started by a kind of, by Bartolomé de las Casas, who wrote a book about the destruction of the Indies and the genocide of native peoples in the Americas. There has been what's been called a black legend, the Spanish black legend, the idea that Spaniards were kind of like maniacal, demonic, genocidal actors. But over the past 20 years, I would say, there's been a real concerted effort by Spain to kind of recoup its image in the Americas. There are documentaries that now talk about the, you know, all the Spaniards who brought religion and civilization and all sorts of other things, enlightenment to the Americas. So Felipe Fernandez Armesto's version of Latino history is kind of in line with that project as well. So I didn't think that the histories of Latinos that exist were getting it exactly right, or telling the whole story. The others, besides Felipe Fernandez Armesto, they really argued that Latinos are defined by their experience of racism by the Spanish Empire and the United States. And so colonialism and its erasures and genocides and sexual violence was the defining characteristic of Latino history. And it's almost a kind of history that downplays change over time because it's a more kind of just continuous story of violence and victimhood over many centuries. And as important as that is, some of them will say things like, you know, one key thing to understand about Latino history, they go back to this idea that like, we are here because you were there. So there are episodes of American military interventions that lead to the migration of Latin American people to the United States, and that's where Latino history comes from. These are very important insights, and I really want to stress that I think that that is a really important, maybe even the dominant thread of Latino history. However, I think that if that's the only story you tell about Latino history, that leads us to the kind of thinking today that goes like, where the hell did these Republicans come from? Because if Latino history is one long story of imperial conquest and racial discrimination, where do these people who believe very different things even come from? And that has led even some of the scholars who, or you know, journalists and scholars who've written these earlier books of Latino history to call Latino conservatives things like sellouts, race traitors. Most recently, Paula Ramos wrote a second book called Defectors. So these are people who deviate in some way from the norm of progressive politics. And I think if you go back to the beginning of history for Latinos and offer a different story, a kind of reappraisal, you wouldn't see them as defectors or traitors or sellouts, because you would see their ideas as part of a much longer history. So it won't any longer seem like they came from nowhere. That's what I'm interested in, and I am happy to hear like all the pushback in the world to this idea, because I understand that, you know, I myself am wrestling with like, okay, you have these different stories, how much weight and emphasis do you place on them? Is it still true that the dominant story to be told is one of imperial conquest and racial discrimination, and then this other story of Latinos who have worked with the Spanish Empire, the American Empire, are very patriotic toward the United States? What if they're 20% of the population, or 30% of the population, maybe 40 or 50% of the population? I don't know. But where do you place the emphasis? And so I just want to start there. What I'm going to do, now that I probably only have 15 more minutes and said I was going to talk about politics and all that stuff, I just want to quickly give you a couple historical examples. One that I find really intriguing is during the early 19th century. Okay, so like when I'm talking about the Spanish colonial period, I think the main stories I want to highlight there are these examples of indigenous alliances with the Spaniards that came from their own self-interest in their wars against their indigenous rivals. So it's not simply a story of genocide and erasure and sexual violence, although it is that. It's also a story of collaboration, alliance, not because they believe false things, but because they thought that their own interests were to ally with the Spaniards to win their battles against their indigenous enemies. And simultaneously, I don't think Catholicism and Spanish are about entire erasure. I think that historians, I think a lot of actually what I'm saying about the Spanish colonial period is that Latino historians need to go back to the work of colonial Latin Americanists, because colonial Latin American historians have known all of this to be true for a long time. They tell much more complicated stories about the colonial period than Latino historians do. That's a gloss of what I'm up to in the chapters about the Spanish colonial period. The 19th century is really interesting to me because I'm sure you're all familiar with this idea that like Latinos will say like, well, yeah, Latino, I'll identify Latino, but I really identify as, Colombian or Mexican or Cuban or Puerto Rican. But those national identities didn't exist before the 19th century. So the time when Latin Americans, former subjects of the Spanish Empire, became the members of individual Latin American nations was during the 19th century. That's when these Latin American nations formed. And I'm thinking about like the father of Latin American independence, someone like Simón Bolívar, the namesake of Bolivia. He's kind of embraced today by both the right and the left as a symbol of Latin American independence. But, Hugo Chavez, everyone from Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan leftist who is now dead and replaced by Nicolas Maduro, he added a star to the Venezuelan flag called the Bolivarian Star, and he calls his revolution a Bolivarian revolution. At the same time, right-wing exiles in Miami gather at the base of the Simón Bolívar statue in Miami on the occasion of various Latin American independence celebrations. They believe they're the heirs of Simón Bolívar as well. So he's an example of someone who can be embraced by both the left and the right. And he was a really important figure in thinking about the writing of Latin American constitutions. The most recent examples of American independence movements were both in the United States and in Haiti by the time that Simón Bolívar was thinking about what the systems of government would be in all these Latin American countries. And there were liberal and conservative sides. They had vigorous debates about whether they would be governed centrally, whether they would be federalists. And Simón Bolívar, at the same time that he is remembered for strong anti-slavery views in order for independence forces who had been loyal to Spaniards before they shifted loyalty to Bolivar, at the same time that he is remembered for his anti-slavery politics, he also believed that, you know, the citizens of newly independent nations weren't ready for American-style democracy. They had to have more of a more kind of I guess strongman leadership would be what it would be called today, but it was more of a Republican concept than a democracy concept. So I think these kinds of histories, especially since the usual story about Latinos in the 19th century is like, you talk about the Texas Revolution and the Alamo and the conquest of Texas. You talk about the US-Mexico War, the conquest of Mexico. You talk about the Spanish-American War that ends the century and the annexation of Cuba and Cuba and Puerto Rico and other islands. And that's a story, a pretty flat story of conquest. And I think it's important to recover these other histories, if only because Latinos today continue to wrestle with the legacies of people like Simón Bolívar. But even more concretely, like when it comes to Mexican Americans fought on both sides of the Texas Revolution, on both sides of the US-Mexico War. After the US-Mexico War, Mexicans who now lived north of the border had the choice to stay in the United States and become American citizens or repatriate to Mexico and resume life as Mexicans. Historians' best estimates are that there were about 80,000 Mexicans living in the land that became the United States who, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, became Mexican Americans. About 75,000 of those 80,000 stayed in the United States. And I think that decision is important for historians to reckon with. It's not necessarily out of a sense of loyalty or American patriotism. It's just where they had built lives, built homes, started families. And so there's this idea that, you know, the Mexicans who decided to stay in the United States, again, were traitors. And they should have gone back to Mexico and resumed life as Mexicans, but that's not what the vast majority of them did. And I think those sorts of stories are important to tell. I want to mention the Spanish-American War quickly. Have you guys heard of that? Spanish-American War, 1898? You chuckle, but not everyone chuckles. I mean, some people don't. But, you know, that's when the United States, the fundamental thing to understand is that they were kind of like more independence wars from Spain, and the United States came in on the side of the independence forces in Puerto Rico and Cuba. And these conflicts started decades in advance. I mean, in Cuba, the independence wars against Spain started in like 1868, 30 years before the United States became involved to help Cuba win independence from Spain. And this is what I mean about the shifting definitions of conservatism. At the time, in 1898, Spain was conservative. That was the kind of like popish religion that, you know, dominated political and social life in Cuba and Puerto Rico. And the United States was a representative of liberalism. And so Puerto Rican women, for example, would talk about how, like, oh, with the United States, there's a lot of increasing travel between the Caribbean and Florida and New York in the late 19th century. And Puerto Rican women would talk about, you know, I can walk down the streets of New York without a chaperone. This is so great. Many of the island's elites would send their kids to schools in the United States. It's the time when evangelical and Protestant churches start to make inroads and, you know, island residents convert from Catholicism to other forms of Christianity, Protestantism, evangelicalism, Pentecostalism, too. And so the United States at the time was seen as the liberating force. And there were even some elites in both political and economic sense in both Cuba and Puerto Rico that actually argued for the annexation of their islands to become United States states within the United States. And I don't know that early history as a kind of pivotal moment in the formation of Latino identity is remembered as much as it should be. And in some ways, the Spanish-American War kind of wound up the clock and set it in motion for the unfolding of all of Puerto Rican history since. Because ever since 1898, the main kind of issue in Puerto Rican history has been its relationship to the United States and whether it would become a state. And there were strong statehood movements in Puerto Rico since before the Spanish-American War, whether it would become independent. And then this new status, I say new because it's still relatively new, the status that we have now of Puerto Rico as a commonwealth didn't even start until 1952. So in many ways, like, Puerto Rican politics today is still very much wrestling with the legacies of 1898. And I think to understand, like, the pro-statehood party today, and even like the Puerto Rican Republicans who have come out in defense of Donald Trump in the past 48 hours, despite the awful things that the speaker said at the rally, you need to understand, in order to understand where they're coming from, why they would be willing to still defend Donald Trump, you need to understand, like, the history of the statehood movement in Puerto Rico and how they've wrestled with the legacies of the Spanish-American War. And they still see statehood as the only way for Puerto Ricans to be admitted into the United States as full equals who can vote in American presidential elections, instead of just serving in the U.S. military but not being able to derive all of the quote-unquote benefits of living in the United States. And so I actually believe that conservatives and liberals in Puerto Rico today both would agree that Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States and is Puerto Ricans are treated as second-class citizens, but they have very different answers to how to fix that. One side will advocate for independence, another side will advocate for statehood. I could go on. It's 3:12. I know that the reception starts at 3:30. I kind of hope that you understand can see where I'm going with some of this. With the 20th century, so much goes on in Latino history in the 20th century. There are nationalist movements defined by people like Pedro Albizu Campos, but then there are, do you guys know who Pedro Albizu Campos is? He was like the nationalist leader of Puerto Rico during the 1930s. He was actually a Harvard-educated lawyer or doctor, I can't remember, who during World War I was very supportive of the United States, but then he became a really important advocate for independence and stood strongly against the U.S. empire because of its military interventions in Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, Haiti in the early 20th century, and its continued kind of control over Puerto Rican and Cuban politics. So he's a kind of Puerto Rican nationalist that today is widely, widely admired among the Puerto Rican left and was admired by the Young Lords in the 1960s, or even earlier during the Cold War by people like Lolita Lebron, who lived in New York at the time that she went and shot up Congress in 1952. And I don't know if you guys have heard of Lolita Lebron, but her name came up again after January 6, 2021, because she was the first person to go fire a gun in Congress before January 6th. So all of a sudden there were new news stories about Lolita Lebron. But she was a kind of disciple of Pedro Albizu Campos. And those kinds of histories, I think, have dominated the telling of Puerto Rican history in the United States, while paying less attention to the statehood movement, both on the island and at home. But I could tell this story in so many other ways too. From the perspective of Mexican American history, you know, we talk about like the deportations of the 1920s and 30s. We talk about the Bracero program, the Operation Wetback in the 1950s, which Donald Trump is kind of invoking again as the last time that we had a kind of mass deportation movement, and he says that his is going to be even bigger and better. And he doesn't call it Operation Wetback, which is the name that it went by in the 1950s, but he does talk about the Eisenhower era deportations. And that frames our understanding of Mexican American history, but there are also all sorts of other histories, like Mexican American Catholics who left Mexico after the Mexican Revolution because the Mexican Revolution came up with a new constitution in 1917 that stripped the Catholic Church of its authority. And so there was a war from 1926 to 29 called the Cristero Wars, when conservative Catholics moved to the United States, built churches in places like Chicago, and they were like really anti-communist, and they called the Mexican Constitution of 1917 a communist and a Marxist-inspired document. And just to give one more example, there's a new brilliant book by Johanna Fernandez, a historian, I think at Baruch, who wrote a book called The Young Lords. It's a brilliant book. You should totally read it. Beautifully written, deeply researched. And she calls it a radical history. And at their height, the Young Lords claimed 3,000 members. That's a lot. And I would even argue that they had outsized importance compared with their numbers. But 3,000 people is still a pretty small slice of the Puerto Rican population. And so what I'm interested in doing is not diminishing the importance of the stories that have been told, but telling other stories alongside them that would actually present a more dynamic and in conflict and tension story about the formation of Latino identity and what it means to be Latino. And, you know, political scientists like Cristina Beltran have said things like, Latino history is a story of permanent contestation. Her book is called The Trouble with Unity, and she's arguing that it's not only not possible, but not even a good idea for Latinos to unify as a single group, because then you kind of minimize our complexity. And so for her, Latino history is an identity, is a story of contestation and constant fighting over it. I've come to think of it in a little different way. I think that what it means to be Latino today is just to be a Latino who participates in the ongoing conversation about what it means to be Latino. And that's what being Latino means. It's not about birth or heritage or descent from Latin America, although that's related to it. It's not about the ability to speak Spanish, although that's related to it. It's really about the constant debate about what it means to be Latino. And I don't even think that's a debate that is ever will be or even meant to be resolved. I think that it's to just keep coming back to the table to participate in it. I think that you can, so I totally lied to you at the beginning of the lecture when I said that I wanted to talk about history, and then I think given the recent events, I would, place more of an emphasis on current day politics. But I kind of suspect that, like, based on what I've said about the history, you can understand what I would say about the politics today. I think that the story about the history that I've told may make it a little more understandable where all of the political fault lines within Latino communities are today. And so I'll stop here, and maybe some of your questions can be about the political moment we're in now that we're a week away from the election, or they can be about the history. But thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to talk more. I love being told how wrong-headed I am, and I'm at the early enough in this project to really be able to respond to feedback and criticism. So
That's
I
some
welcome their thoughts.
encouragement.
Yeah.
Let's start with our Wolf Institute tradition. Let's start with a student, and then I'll go to the faculty.
So you mentioned that your grandfather was a Republican voter, and I want to know where, because you are the speaker, where do you stand personally about it? What's your opinion?
Well, I told you also that my opinion is that I should. I always wrestle with whether I should just out myself from the beginning to understand more about where I'm coming from. The only hint I really gave you is that I spent my childhood arguing with him about politics, suggesting that we're not on the same page. I've never voted for a Republican, but I do think that the conversations that I had with him over a long period of time led me to also not believe right out of the gate that he was misinformed or wrong to feel the way that he did. So more than most, I'm probably willing to entertain the idea that I, as a liberal Democrat, don't have all of the right answers and am willing to listen to others.
Well,
Yeah.
I know it's not really about the labeling or whatever. I think more of my question is, to recognize this alternative history, right? To recognize this kind of a minority in the usual, the usual image of what we think most Latinos believe, right?
Yeah.
The insistence to push this alternative history out there. And then what would be next?
What would be next is a great question because, so what are my personal motivations? I don't believe that Latino can only mean a particular political project. I don't believe that. I had one of my students who read one of my chapters about a conservative Mexican-American department store owner say, after they read it, this guy's not even Latino. Why are we even talking about this guy in a Latino history class? And it was the first time that I had encountered the idea that Latino, in addition to whatever else it may be, is a particular political project. And I can accept that that's how some Latinos would understand the term. But what I don't understand is how you would then tell a Latino who has a different understanding of what it means to be Latino that they are not Latino. So I'm also not about gatekeeping of Latino identity. I don't think, I was talking to someone yesterday who's half Chilean, half Jewish. And I would say that the fastest growing cohort of Latinos is third and fourth generation Latinos. So who have intermarried, moved to suburbs. We know today that maybe only 30% of Latinos are fluent in Spanish. So does that mean that the 70% of Latinos who are not fluent in Spanish, or I think it's as high as 30% of Latinos who intermarry, are they less Latino than Latinos who are closer to the immigrant experience, closer to, who speak Spanish? Another interesting thing to me is the idea that Spanish and the ability to speak Spanish is somehow representative of authenticity, when where did that language come from? That's a European language, so it's, what's that? It's a fact. So I'm just saying, to me, where do we go next? So these are some of my personal motivations. I'm someone who I guess is always invested in and drawn to topics that somehow complexify what it means to be Latino, because I actually don't believe that there is such a thing as Latino group identity. I want to be careful when I say that because there are 60 million people in the United States for whom their Latino identity is important, who self-identify as Latino. So I'm not saying Latino isn't real because I think I call myself a Latino, that's real. That might mean something totally different to everyone else in this room. But I don't believe that there's such a thing as Latino group identity. And I think that Latinos, all of us, again, I don't mean to speak for anyone or everyone, but I think that what it means to be Latino is to constantly be thinking about what the relationship is between our individual and group identity, whether we are part of a group, how much we are part of a group, what it means to be authentic, things like that. Does that help answer a little more like where I'm coming from and how I see things?
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
And I'm happy to be disagreed with. I say that that's my view and recognize that many other Latinos have different views of what it means to be Latino. But even to me, even the fact that we have different views of what it means to be Latino suggests that there can't be a group identity.
Yeah, for
Unity.
sure.
Unity.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna let somebody else.
We can talk
ask a
afterwards
question.
too, yeah. I mean, that conversation could go on for a
And
long
there is
time.
always a reception afterwards if you want to continue
Totally.
to ask questions. We have a couple of hands up. I want to make sure we get to them.
Okay, Professor Cadava, welcome and thank you for your lecture.
Thank you.
I'm a sociology professor here at Brooklyn College, but also I am an expert in Latin American politics,
Yeah.
which is the field in which I got my master's degree.
Mhm.
I agree with you when you say that Latino cannot be boxed into a specific political project. And since we have students, most of the attendees, they are students, I just want to offer just a recommendation for them. So, for instance, this is a book you might know and you read as a historian. This is a book by Benedict Anderson, Imagine Community,
Yep.
Reflection on the Origin and Spread of Nationalisms. That is also available in Spanish under the title Comunidades Imaginarias, Reflexiones sobre el origen y la difusión del nacionalismo. So in that book, Benedict Anderson explained that every nation on earth is the result of the process of imagination by their elites. And Latin American countries are not the exception. All Latin American countries were imagined by a Criollo elite against lo negro, the black, and against lo indio. So Latin American identity is like a nation, is something that is always in the making. For instance, in this classroom, I have my former student identifies as Afro-Latino, Afro-Mexican. That idea of Afro-Mexicanidad is something new because historically, Mexico or Colombia or Brazil or Bolivia, Argentina, they all rejected lo indio and lo negro. So for instance, in Mexico, where I lived for 13 years, I was a professor there. So el rubio, la rubia, el güero y la güera is someone who usually think that he or she is an European. And when that person moved to the United States of America, most probably that person is ready to enter into a process of whiteness. So people who might think that being Latino means, you have to vote Democratic, they don't understand nothing about the project of the formation of a nation,
Totally.
and they don't understand nothing about that idea of Latinidad, etc. And I will end with that comment. So, you mentioned Bolivar, but myself, I was born in Haiti. I'm Haitian. So, but Latin America being the origin, the sociogenesis of being Latino is because it's part of the Romances languages.
Yeah.
Speaking French, as I do, is part of Latin America. But when we see Latin American historian, basically, they don't use sociological, concept. They usually excluded Haiti. Why Haiti is part of Latin America? This is the country that helped Simon Bolivar to liberate Gran Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia, Venezuela, etc. So This is a very complex issue.
Totally.
And Latin American identity is very complex, and it's part, or it's our job to educate our students to understand, because the media won't do that, and the media, most of the time, they don't have the expertise to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You're introducing at least 2, maybe 3 points of complication to what I was saying, which has to do with Latinos needing to have a better understanding, on the one hand, of Latin American history, and another area would be race making and racial formation in Latin America, and 3 would be the role that countries like Haiti or Francophone countries, things like that, play in the formation of what it means to be Latin America. And this relates to conversations we had yesterday about like these debates today about the racial identity of Latinos, because we were talking about the Census Bureau's decision to include Latino and Hispanic as a race on the 2030 census, and it's actually Afro-Latinos who've pushed back on that decision the most, because their slogan is Latino is not a race. And of course it's not. I don't think anyone in this room would deny that Latino is not a race, because if it is, what is the racial identity of Latinos? I mean, it spans a spectrum. And the particular worry of Afro-Latinos, I'm thinking about sociologists like Nancy Lopez, legal scholars like Tanya Kateri Hernandez, would be that it would lead to an undercount of the Afro-Latino population if Latino and Hispanic are a race. But this is where it gets interesting, because I think the project to have Latino and Hispanic made a race on the 2030 census has everything to do with the Chicano civil rights movement, because it's groups like NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, or other liberal advocacy groups like Voto Latino, Mi Familia Vota, that it's about their understanding that Laura Gomez, the sociologist and law professor I mentioned, she's a real proponent of this too, to argue that the main definition of what brings Latino people together is their common experience of racism in the United States. That's what Latino identity is about. And they want Latino identity and Latino racial identity to exist alongside the history of African Americans. And they want Latinos to be seen as a race like African Americans are seen as a race. But people like Nancy Lopez push back on this idea by talking about race isn't a biological fact. She wants us to all think of street race, which is the race that you are recognized as when you walk down the street. And there, I think it's just patently obvious that there are Black Latinos, white Latinos, indigenous Latinos. And so the racial identity of Latinos is far more complicated than most Latino scholars have been willing to admit, I think, and that also stems from Latin America. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have to end now? Yeah, I know it's my fault. I mean, I know it's my fault, but like, totally. Yeah.
Well, we don't have to end, but there are a
Yeah.
number of students who have to go to class.
I'm
the new
so
class
sorry.
period starting,
Yeah,
and
thank
some
you.
of our faculty as well. But
Yeah.
please, if you're here, please make sure you join us in the Kimmick room, the Lily Pond room, for our reception, and you can continue to ask
I'd
questions.
love that. Yeah.
Thank you so much for Phi Beta
Thank
Kappa
you.
for sponsoring this. Thank you, Professor Cadava.
Yeah, thank you. I always do this. I always do it, Gaston. I'm so sorry.
Complex stuff. I will
I
see
know.
you over there. Gonna go with the
Okay, go over, yeah. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Yeah.
Jerry, thanks so much.